Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 13 on USA conflict 1954 to 1975. Now this video, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at a word called radical. What does radical mean, ladies and gentlemen? Well, if we have a look in our dictionary, we find radical, and it's talking about a word that we often use, change. But it says, and I'm quoting here, radical, extreme or fundamental changes. And that's what we are looking at. The first 12 videos, we've looked at the struggle for civil rights in America, particularly in the southern states. And I suppose you could say some progress had been made due to the work of the civil rights activists, groups like CORE, NAACP, SNCC, etc. Martin Luther King had begun to change people's perceptions. The Supreme Court had passed many decisions supporting the civil rights. President Kennedy, President Johnson, they were both more on side with civil rights compared to previous presidents, for example, Eisenhower. And also new laws had been passed. Our previous video, we looked at the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But ladies and gentlemen, for some, the pace of change was too slow. They were frustrated, particularly young black people in urban areas, in cities in the northern states. They wanted a more radical, extreme, fundamental change. And to get it, some people said we need a different tactic, more aggressive, new strategies compared to the established non-violent tactic of Martin Luther King. So that's what this video is all about, ladies and gentlemen, the rise of a different type of tactic in the civil rights movement. And the man that we are going to concentrate on in this video, a very, very interesting man, ladies and gentlemen. There it is. If you can just see it there, just about there, you might see Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. Malcolm X. Well, nobody's called X. What's going on there? Well, let's have a look at the life of this man. Very interesting character, very charismatic, got people on side. He was a brilliant speaker, just like Martin Luther King. He was a fantastic organizer, as I'll refer to later in this video. He was very persuasive, but he had a different message to Martin Luther King. Now, he wasn't born Malcolm X. X isn't a name, it's a letter. He was actually born Malcolm Little. That was his surname. His father died when he was only 6 years of age. Now, his father had probably been murdered by white supremacists, something like the Ku Klux Klan. Malcolm Little had a very unhappy childhood. In the end, he was fostered, he faced racism. In schools, the teachers were not particularly kind to him. Eventually, he moved to New York, where he got involved in a life of crime, drug dealing, burglary, etc. And I suppose inevitably, Malcolm Little ended up in prison. 6-year prison sentence. Whilst he was in prison, ladies and gentlemen, something happened which changed his life. He converted to the religion, the faith of Islam. He became a Muslim. And he joined a group called the Nation of Islam, sometimes known as NOI, the Nation of Islam. And it was here, as a Muslim, that he changed his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X. Well, why would he do that? He wasn't alone, actually. But the thinking at the time was, right, here I am, Malcolm Little. My father, born in America, but we've got black skin. Therefore, somewhere in our past, maybe our great-great-great-grandfather, hundreds of years ago in our family history, our family was brought to America from Africa as slaves. We were then bought and we were given the name Little. So he thought that Little was almost like his slave name. He said, my real name, my real family name is unknown, X. It's unknown. That's why he called himself Malcolm X. Excuse me. Now, many other members of the Nation of Islam did the same. They all changed their name to X. I suppose you could say they were the first X-Men. That's quite a super joke. No, it's not. It's a marvellous joke. Marvel. That's enough. That's enough. Let's get serious. Now, Malcolm X joins the Nation of Islam. When he is released from prison, he becomes a minister for the Nation of Islam, and eventually he becomes a spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Remember, I said, 1, he was a brilliant speaker, and 2, he was very good at organising. And because of the work of Malcolm X and others, the membership of the Nation of Islam gradually increased, so that by 1964, some people have estimated that it had as many as 100,000 members. The key point, 75% of its membership were aged 17 to 35. Malcolm X was appealing to the young black communities, particularly in poor areas of the city, urban deprivation, and they are listening to his message. Now, what were the beliefs of Malcolm X? As I've hinted already, they were different to Martin Luther King. Malcolm X, at this stage of his life, he rejected King's non-violent approach. He said, look, here's a quote from 1964. He said, black people should be able to defend themselves, quote, by any means necessary. He did not rule out the use of violence if a black person was being attacked by a racist white person. It's a different approach to Martin Luther King, ladies and gentlemen. He's saying, look, we've seen it with our own eyes. White people do not want to give equality to black people. He says, despite the Supreme Court, despite your laws, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Malcolm X looked at the actions of police chiefs like Bull Connor and said, look, they will not willingly give it to us. They do not want to give us equality. Look at the police. Look at the Ku Klux Klan. Look at the white citizens' councils. Look at the murders down in Mississippi. We might have to fight for it. If the Ku Klux Klan come and bully us, what do you do to a bully? Do you give up or do you fight back? Can you see he's got a slightly different approach here to Martin Luther King? Indeed, remember from some of the previous videos, Martin Luther King and his very famous I Have a Dream speech after the March to Washington. Well, Malcolm X was very critical. He said, you've marched to Washington, but it's all organised by the white people. You're standing in front of the statue of President Lincoln. Well, Lincoln didn't like black people when he was alive. Can you see it's a different approach? He actually called the March to Washington, here's a quote, he said, I observed that circus. Remember in my previous videos, they used to sing, we shall overcome someday. But for Malcolm X, someday was too far away in the future. Change was happening at too slow a pace. He says, yeah, you're all singing we shall overcome, but the blacks were having, a quote, a nightmare. And I suppose if you look at what was happening in parts of the Deep South, you could see why he would say that. So he's got a different approach. He doesn't really believe in working with whites. He wants to be more separate. One thing he did say, and I'm speaking here as an old retired teacher, he said, without education, you are not going anywhere in this world. He himself had been denied a good education, ended up in prison. He wanted black people to get educated. Remember James Meredith and the case to try to get into the University of Mississippi. So he wanted them to be educated, but he just didn't think that the setup in America was fair, and he didn't think that the whites would help the blacks, and he's beginning to come to the idea that the blacks will have to help themselves by standing up against the whites. This was his different message to Martin Luther King, who was more willing to work with the whites who were on the black side. Can you see the difference between the two? But then something happened. 1964, a key year. Malcolm X fell out with the leader of the Nation of Islam, a man called Elijah Muhammad. He didn't like the way that Elijah Muhammad was leading his life. So he fell out with him. And then he went on pilgrimage, a religious holy journey to Mecca, the most important place in the religion of Islam. And when he returned from Mecca on pilgrimage, he returned a slightly different person. He altered or changed his beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, he set up two groups, MMI, Muslim Mosque Incorporated, sometimes called Muslim Mosque Inc., MMI. And he also set up another group, the Organization of African American Unity. The thought that people in Africa, people in America, black people should all get together and help each other. So he's come back a slightly different person. Also changed are some of his ideas about civil rights. Slightly changed man. After his pilgrimage to Mecca, he decides to work with some of the other civil rights groups like CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SNCC. Well, CORE in particular had a significant white membership. Well, before the pilgrimage, Malcolm X didn't really want to have anything to do with white people. Now he's willing to talk to them, willing to share ideas, see if they can work together. It's a change. He's beginning to reject his old ideas that blacks and whites would be separate, separatism as it was called. He also continued to attack the Nation of Islam and its leader Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam were not pleased with this, and they firebombed his house. And then, on the 21st of February 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated by three members of the Nation of Islam. Three black Muslims waited for him. He was giving a speech in Harlem, New York, and they ran up and they shot him 15 times. More than 15,000 people were at his funeral, ladies and gentlemen. The life of Malcolm X. A very, quite a short life, but a very, very interesting life. Now, just before we finish, let's try and have a look at the significance of Malcolm X. Why is he important in the history of America and the civil rights struggle? Well, here's a few things to think about. Number one, some historians have suggested he did more to raise the self-esteem, raise the spirits of black Americans, particularly the youth in the cities, particularly in the northern cities. He's inspiring them. Remember, many of the black youth joined the Nation of Islam because of Malcolm X's speeches. He was a fantastic orator. He showed that he was unwilling to accept racism. He would be ready to stand up and fight against it, fighting in a different way to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, non-violence. Malcolm X, violence if necessary. If we are attacked, we will fight back. Raising the self-esteem. He was different to Martin Luther King. It's a different way forward. Now, remember what I just said. When he returned from pilgrimage, he had changed his ideas. He had changed his beliefs. He was more willing to sort of work with other civil rights groups. He was more willing to go with integration, whites and blacks together. But he came back in 64 and he was killed in 65, February. So we only had a few months, under a year really, of Malcolm X's new changed attitudes. Therefore, after his death, most people remembered him for his attitude before his change, before the pilgrimage. So he was remembered more for the confrontation, the separatism. And that led to a rise in black nationalism, black self-defense against white racist violence, led to the rise of something called Black Power, a group called the Black Panthers, men called, for example, Stokely Carmichael. Now, Black Power, Black Panthers, Stokely Carmichael, what is going on there, ladies and gentlemen? What are their ideas for the civil rights struggle in America? That, of course, will be the next video. But as we'll see, when we look at what they did, we can link it back to this man, Malcolm X, a hugely important person in the civil rights struggle. As ever, ladies and gentlemen, I hope it's been useful. I'll see you soon. All the best now.